There are a lot of different kinds of correlations that a person can do. We're going to focus on three of them in this class, really on two of them. I'll mention this third, the interclass correlation coefficient, the ICC. This is what you often see in the literature associated with psychometric measurements or psychometric evaluations of measures. We're not going to use the ICC in this class, mostly because it's just harder to calculate using a spreadsheet or an online calculator. You really need a statistics program, something like SPSS or the R programming language. The nice thing about the ICC is that it measures both correlation and agreement. So here you can see three sets of data. M1 and M2 are correlated and they agree fairly closely. This M2 prime, all I did was just add 3 to each value. So it's just a little bit different. It agrees less with M1. And if you're doing something like test-retest reliability, where you expect to get exactly the same thing on both readings or close to it, the interclass correlation coefficient will give you that measure of correlation and agreement. And you can see here it distinguishes between the relationship between M1 and M2 and M1 and M2 prime. The correlation that we're going to spend the most time with is probably the Pearson product moment coefficient, the PPMC. That's, you may see it as R or as R sub P. This measures correlation, but not agreement. So you can see here, the Pearson correlation coefficient is exactly the same for these sets of data points. So you have to be a little bit careful about looking at your data, graphing it, making sure that if you're interested in both correlation and agreement, you either need to find a way to do the ICC or just be careful when you're evaluating it with Pearson's. The Spearmint correlation coefficient is the non-parametric version of correlation. It's a non-parametric Pearson correlation. So it's also measuring correlation but not agreement. This is a flowchart for choosing which kind of correlation you want to use, or you'll be able to use. Basically, if both of your variables are interval or ratio and normally distributed, you can use Pearson. Otherwise, you need to use Spearmint. So first thing you'll do is figure out what's your level of measurement. If it's ordinal, you go right to Spearmint. If it's interval or ratio, you'll use the Shapiro-Wilk test to figure out if your data is normally distributed. And if one or both of those variables is not normally distributed, you'll use the Spearmint. Otherwise, you'll use the Pearson. Now, the nice thing about using the Pearson is that in addition to the p-value, you also get a confidence interval. You can calculate a confidence interval for Spearmint, but again, it's not something that's easily available on an online calculator or within a spreadsheet, so we're not going to cover it in class. For the Spearmint, you can get a p-value, but not a confidence interval. And a little later in this video, if you've got nominal data, you'll use something called the chi-squared test for independence.